They will try and overcompensate by making sure that everything is hyper controlled. So you're in a relationship with a narcissistic individual. You might try to compensate by making sure everything's very controlled, very organized. This can be exhausting. People in these relationships will find themselves almost at an obsessive and almost compulsive level of trying to control the environment, of trying to control their own words or their own behaviors enough. So the possibility of activating the blame shifting tirade in the narcissist is minimized. Let's talk about minimization, because I'm not going to minimize it. Like I said, I don't think minimization gets enough attention, and I think it's such a damaging dynamic in narcissism. I think we minimize minimization when we think and we talk about narcissism and narcissistic abuse. We all know that minimization is part of the classical patterns of what happens in a narcissistic relationship. But I am actually going right now, that's why I'm not in my usual place, through a bit of a family narcissistic thing right now that has gotten pretty bad. And it's dovetailed with what I'm seeing my clients experience. So I wanted to talk about this. So the question is, how does minimization show up in narcissistic relationships? How does it get in the way of healing? And why is it so common in the narcissistic space? Minimization is a form of denial and of gaslighting that I've talked about on this channel. The narcissistic person will often minimize your experiences, your distress, your feelings. In fact, it is minimization that often results in the emotional escalation that often happens in encounters in narcissistic relationships. For example, also, when something bad happens to the narcissistic person, well, the planet has to stop spinning. But when something happens to the bad happens to the other person in the relationship, it's not that big a deal, right? Think about how many narcissistic arguments that you have been involved in where you were saying, hey, wait a minute, when something like this that happened to me happened to you, it was the end of the world. And now it's happening to me and you're making it out like it's nothing. How come it was a big deal when it was you? And at those times you may escalate and they'll say, oh, you need to quiet down, right? Minimization. It's gaslighting because it challenges your reality. You are actually going through something and it's painted out as being not that big a deal when it's actually very important and very impactful for you. And then when you are more insistent and say, hey, this is a big deal to me, then the narcissistic person will say, oh, why are you always so dramatic and exaggerating? What is wrong with you? So you see how that sequence works. Minimization is part of the double standard of all narcissistic relationships, different sets of rules that they have for themselves and the rest of the world. They get the flu and it is a health emergency. You get the flu and you are being a hypochondriac. And as a result, it is one of the more frustrating of the patterns of the narcissistic relationship. The narcissistic folks are so grandiose and competitive that even their pain has to be more and better than everyone else's. The minimization experience in the narcissistic relationship is a major issue around why people feel so unsafe and so unheard in these relationships. For healthy people, going through something is how they become more empathic. Many times, we may be at some risk of minimizing if we haven't actually gone through something another person has. For example, I'll give you an example. If a person doesn't have children and they have no idea what sleep deprivation is, but then they end up having children and they may even feel bad that they were not more empathic to the sleep interruption of their friends who had children before them. Now, that awareness, that cycle does not play out in narcissistic relationships. Instead, after the narcissistic person goes through something, just when you think they might be more empathic, get it, that they're actually more likely to minimize other people's experiences. I'll share this. I recently saw this happen in two family members, one of whom had a massive 12-hour life-threatening surgery that will require years of rehabilitation, and the narcissistic family member comparing a rather routine surgery that took them about an hour or two. I think that was even managed outpatient or one night in the hospital, 6 weeks of your usual post-operative recovery back to normal. And the narcissistic person kept trying to minimize even how many hours the surgery for the more ill person took in that more severe situation. It was actually rather upsetting to witness because it was akin to comparing a stubbed toe to a traumatic brain injury. And it was really translating into a minimization of the pain of the person with a more severe illness and the psychological trauma and the physical limitations and the rehabilitative demands of the person who went through the far, far more massive health crisis. This was invalidating to witness, and it was even dangerous for the person who went through the massive surgery because adequate allowances were not being made for healing, and the expectations that the person who had the massive surgery were not realistic, like that they'll be able to pop right back to normal. So that means that the narcissistic person might be more likely to get angry at the person with the long recovery period for not just popping back to normal life as they did, the narcissist did after their minor surgery. I have witnessed this health minimization dynamic happen to many clients of mine who had cancer or other life-threatening diseases, complicated pregnancies and deliveries, and narcissistic partners and family members would minimize the experiences of the people with those health crises. And frankly, that significantly complicated the healing for those folks, and in some cases, their outcomes. And it left massive psychological scars that another person, even when directly witnessing their physical deterioration, were unwilling to validate and take notice of the suffering that the other person endured. Minimization also results in other invalidating and confusing moments. Any difficult human experience someone may have, or grief, a broken heart, a massive professional disappointment, a failed exam, a loss. All of these experiences, which if they had happened to the narcissistic person would be throwing a tantrum and expect the earth to stop spinning for them. But when it happens to the other person, in the narcissistic relationship, they will often find themselves being told, hey, come on, it's not that big a deal. Come on, people get over this stuff. You're just taking it too seriously. This can happen with narcissistic parents in particular. And people raised by narcissistic parents will have childhoods that were characterized by parents who minimized everything, leaving them going into adulthood, not even having a gauge for how to manage disappointment and sadness or even illness. When you go through something real and are having a real reaction to it, and then someone minimizes it, it really does interrupt the grief and the healing process. Minimization is also the enabler's game. I have a theory on this. I sometimes think the enablers minimize because of their childish need for everything to just be okay, even if that means letting the narcissist off the hook. In fact, typically it means letting the narcissist off the hook. Again, something I am observing very clearly, like in this familial situation I'm witnessing, when a person who is very ill and will require permanent massive life changes, I'm getting the message that like, hey, look how great they're doing. They're just getting better so fast. Now, the people making these observations are often people who don't want to show up and aren't actually directly witnessing the person who has had the massive health problem, but they want to weigh in, but they don't want to deal with the fallout of the bigger and the more disruptive decisions that need to be made on behalf of the sicker person. It's as though having to see the situation realistically would be too painful for them, so they minimize. Minimization by enablers is probably the central pillar of collective gaslighting. That idea that when everyone jumps on the bandwagon and says, oh, come on, it's not that bad, effectively shutting down the person or the people who are suffering and struggling in a narcissistic relationship. Because if everyone is saying, oh, it's not that bad, and look how great it's going, The people on the receiving end of the narcissistic abuse may actually feel like they're exaggerating. And there's that self-gaslighting again. In many ways, I think minimization is a major reason narcissism has become such a big problem in our culture overall. Journalists, other people with platforms, mental health practitioners, just about everyone tends to minimize the impact of the patterns that we see in narcissism and the fallout on our mental health, in family court, and human resource, in society at large. It tends to be it can't be that bad, or you're making too much of it, or I'm sure things aren't that bad for you, or this is how relationships are, or using minimizing language like, oh, they're just intense or quirky or demanding, rather than using the simple word abuse that captures the reality. When the damaging impacts of narcissism on other people are minimized by the entire world, you end up where we are right now, in a world that is an absolute uncivil, entitled mess. All this minimization, it takes a toll. People in narcissistic relationships, when they minimize what's happening to them, all of that stress has to go somewhere. Lots of survivors blame themselves for being too dramatic or making a mountain out of a molehill. There's a proverb. But over time, as the narcissistic abuse continues and the person keeps minimizing, we can see anxiety symptoms, health problems, even panic attacks. By denying reality to themselves, I can promise you this, that reality will always find another way to come back and bite you. Now, not all minimizers are enablers or narcissists. Some simply feel so helpless and powerless that by minimizing, they can cope with a situation where they feel unable to help another person or do something to be able to fix the situation. If you are in a chronically abusive relationship, people may see the abusive patterns and recognize that there are reasons it cannot change, but they still may try to soft pedal it to make themselves feel better about it and to push down those feelings of helpless discomfort. That doesn't make it okay. I get it. But people in pain, as most people going through narcissistic abuse are, sometimes want someone to just sit in the pain with them and acknowledge that it's awful and perhaps unchangeable. As a therapist, it's the hardest part of my job to just sit with the pain of a client and not want to just fix it. And the helplessness of watching a narcissistic relationship can often contribute to a person who is in one of these relationships getting more and more isolated. Nobody often wants to talk to them because it evokes so much powerlessness. So people just stop calling. Most survivors of narcissistic abuse are there. They know that these patterns are unchangeable. They aren't expecting anyone to wave a magic wand. Sometimes survivors of narcissistic abuse just want to hold someone's hand in the darkness as they begin to recover. We don't talk enough about minimization when we talk about narcissistic abuse, because I think it's important to do so because it impacts people in every way in these relationships. People tend to minimize what's happening in their own narcissistic relationships as well. It's why we don't talk about it. And the narcissists always minimize the harm that they do to other people and the difficulties that other people have in their lives. The people around you minimize it, and the world at large minimizes it. So everyone's minimizing it. And all of this minimization is one of the brightest and the hottest parts of the gaslight. I see what it is. It's a way for other people to not deal with the big problem that's in front of all of us. And while I understand why people may want to cope by denying the magnitude of a problem they cannot fix, the damage of minimization to a person who is in a narcissistically abusive relationship and cannot trust their reality is massive. Like I said, I'm in a tough situation right now in my life, so I'm right there with all of you. And minimization is happening around me, left, right, and center. It has really put a finer point on how destructive this is. And I recognize it takes a lot of courage, goodness, and wisdom for a person to hear another person's story of narcissistic abuse and not minimize it, but just be with it. If you are going through narcissistic abuse, it's always my reminder, please know that this is real. Stop minimizing what is happening to you. If you're watching someone else go through it, never minimize their experience, just be with them. Once we turn off the gas lights, we need people who hold the lights to help us get out of these dark spaces. So I hope that gives you an understanding that minimization isn't just sort of one sort of side little theme. It's actually very central to understanding narcissistic abuse and the impact it's having on you. And sometimes having this framework can really, really help. A bad worker always blames their tools. You may or may not have heard this proverb, but this one actually has some pretty old origins, as all of these do. This one is traced to the 13th century French. I could not find a particular author associated with this. And then back then, the way that phrase translated from the French was that basically a bad tradesperson can never find the right tool. Now, I think you understand what the saying means, right? It makes sense at the face of it. If a person is unskilled, and on top of that is also uninsightful or lacks self-reflective capacity, they blame the lack of a tool rather than their own inability or their own irresponsibility. It's a bit like victimhood mixed with blame. So when we take this proverb, a bad worker blames their tools, we take this one and we elevate it beyond the tools. Really what it's saying, it's a glimpse at the blame deflection that is a central core of narcissism. Narcissists have a very hard time taking responsibility or blame, so they push it out. So just like that bad worker who blames the shoddy work on a lack of tools or blames their inability to fix something on not having the right tool, the narcissistic personality will blame everyone in their lives for the mistakes that they make. People with this personality style blame others for their failures, for their disappointments, for their stress, for their frustrations. This makes these relationships incredibly challenging because you're constantly being blamed for their issues. In fact, in the early conversations with a narcissistic individual, when you first meet them, you will actually find yourself trying to engage with their blaming. You'll say things like, I didn't do that. That's not my fault. No, really, I'm not the one who did that. And on and on and on. You know where that goes. Now, really, at these times, reality doesn't matter to them at those times with those personality styles. Reality doesn't matter to people who are narcissistic. It's all about them being able to cast blame out so they can maintain their grandiose and perfectionistic version of themselves. I don't make mistakes. It's everybody else's fault. The bad sales presentation wasn't their fault. It was the client's fault for rescheduling. It was the assistant's fault for not getting the materials organized on time. It was their partner's fault for not keeping the house quieter while they were preparing for the sales presentation. It's everybody else's fault. And that blame deflection is a classical element of these relationships, the proverbial bad tools. The blame projection and deflection of the narcissistic relationship, honestly, for a lot of people who go through these relationships, is one of the most exhausting, destabilizing, confusing, and manipulating parts of these relationships. Sort of them not being able to find their tools and blaming everyone else often means that other people end up taking too much responsibility, even for things that they are not responsible for. So the person who's not the narcissist takes on all the responsibility. It's not their responsibility. And because of taking all this responsibility for things you didn't even do, that can really result to holding on to negative emotions like guilt and self-blame. And over time, if you spend enough time with a person who's narcissistic, they don't even have to blame you after a while. You get so indoctrinated into their way of thinking that you self-blame before they can blame you. It's almost like after a while, you just sort of cut out the manipulative middleman and you do it to yourself. Sometimes people who find themselves in narcissistic relationships, now whether this is a family of origin relationship, whether this is an intimate relationship or a workplace relationship, they will try and overcompensate by making sure that everything is hyper controlled. So you're in a relationship with a narcissistic individual. You might try to compensate by making sure everything's very controlled, very organized. This can be exhausting. People in these relationships will find themselves almost at an obsessive and almost compulsive level of trying to control the environment, of trying to control their own words or their own behaviors enough. So the possibility of activating the blame shifting tirade in the narcissist is minimized. And then you just keep appeasing and enabling the narcissist. You've got the house so organized that if they're like, it's your fault I couldn't find the scissors are exactly where they need to be. It's really difficult because to steer clear of being blamed by someone else who is clearly not taking responsibility means that you have to work on your own sense of self-assurance, to be clear and aware on what you are responsible for, to be clear and aware of what you're not responsible for, and understand that some of it is gray and that there is shared responsibility. The narcissistic individual is engaged in a very unconscious and a very primitive process of projection and offloading of shameful or uncomfortable deficits that they don't want to have to keep stirring in themselves. And so they project them onto other people. And the narcissistic disconnection from empathy actually means it's easier to blame others because you don't stop to think, they don't stop to think, how would someone feel if I blame them for this when they're not really responsible? The challenge is that the blame shifting is also often coupled with victimization and a sense of persecution. A person who is narcissistic will say, I can't find the right tool. And that's because nobody supports me having the right tools, or they hide my tools. Things like, I screwed up the sales presentation because people are out to get me and nobody believes in me or wants to support me. That self-victimization is such a classical piece of the narcissistic personality style. So whomever was this frustrated French writer who watched people do a lousy job and blame other people actually did a really nice job of capturing this dynamic of the bad worker blaming their tools and clearly telling us that this is a part of what human behavior and difficult human behavior and what some people do and have always done for hundreds of years, not taking responsibility and then blaming something or someone else for their failings. But it's always best in these blame shifty times not to engage or to engage minimally. If they blame you for something that is clearly really something you didn't do, you just nod politely and just say a gentle, okay, document when needed, and then recognize that they're never going to listen to your version of the events. Some people say, it's unjust, it's unjust. Why shouldn't they hear that I'm not the one responsible? It is unjust, and they aren't listening.
In 1938, there was a play called Gaslight. In 1944, there was a film. And the basic premise of the play and the film was that there was a man who was basically trying to make his wife go mad. And back then, it was based at a time when instead of electric lights, there were these gas-powered lights, and you could turn them up and down. And he kept playing with the lights, these gas lamps. And she would say, he would turn the light down, and she'd say, who turned the light down? He said, the light's not any lower than it was before. And slowly but surely, she started losing her grip with reality because he kept denying that he was manipulating the lights. So that's where that term gaslighting comes from. And we retain the same meaning. It basically means to manipulate someone else's reality with techniques like denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying. Anyone who's ever experienced gaslighting knows how confusing it can be. Because it's designed to make you doubt your own reality And any break from reality is actually defined as psychosis. We can rather quickly find ourselves feeling like we're losing our minds. And we can't imagine that somebody who loves us would ever doubt our reality. Let me give you a sort of classical example of gaslighting. You're having a conversation with someone, and maybe it's over and over about the same thing. It's about your partner is sort of has this kind of inappropriate relationship with someone he or she works with, and then he says something to you like, like he or she they dress they were just really cute at work. Why don't you start dressing like that or wearing your hair like that? And as you could imagine, someone would be like, that doesn't feel good to hear that. And then the gaslighter will say, don't be so sensitive. So now all of a sudden, you've done nothing more than merely expressed a very real feeling in a situation. And someone's doubting your reality by saying, don't be so sensitive. Or other classic gaslighting lines include, you have no right to feel that way. Or, that never happened. Or, are you okay? Are you doing okay? Because you keep saying weird stuff. I'm starting to worry about you. All of these things are designed to make you doubt yourself. Gaslighting in that way is a tool of psychological control. The more you can question someone's reality, the more control you have over them. Something else you would see is that, for example, you might make plans with someone, and you'll say very specifically, okay, just so we're clear, I just want to make sure you said that you're good with us going to dinner at that restaurant at 7 o'clock because I'm calling other people to make a reservation. Okay, yeah, sure, yeah, whatever. Because narcissists never listen, they often, sort of blithely go and do their own thing, or they may have something better come up, and so they don't want to do dinner. So then the next day when you say, hey, it's time to go, and they'll say, what are you doing? And they'll say, I made that reservation. You said everyone's getting together. And they'll say, I never said I'd do that. I never said we were going to go to dinner. And that's when you're like, you start rocking and saying, I don't understand. I don't understand what's happening. A combination of factors in a narcissist make them classical gaslighters, if you will. Obviously, their lack of empathy, because they don't care who they hurt, and they don't care that they're fooling with your mind. Their tendency to want to control people, that also makes it very much a key gaslighting dynamic. Narcissists are very manipulative, and by definition, gaslighting is a tool of manipulation. All of these things sort of come together and conspire to make it that the narcissist is a classic gaslighter. Over time, the gaslighting, if it's chronic, can literally make a person feel as though they're losing their grip with reality. It'll lead them to be full of self-doubt. They'll often start doubting themselves in other relationships, at work. They may feel like they're not good parents anymore. I always say, though, the ringer on whether you're being gaslit, it's a very simple test. If you've ever been in a relationship of any kind, not just an intimate partner relationship, it can even be with your mother. Parents can gaslight you, your siblings can gaslight you, anyone can test your reality in this way. Or boss, anyone like that. If you've ever felt the need to record a conversation because you want to play it back for that person, or even play it back for yourself, so you can be sure you heard it right, you're being gaslighted. I can guarantee it, because that's the only reason you would feel the need to record a conversation. People who are in narcissistic relationships, even when they're not supposed to record their conversations, will, like I said, for no other reason, to play it back for themselves and say, okay, I am not losing my mind. That is truly and really what they said. Here's where it gets interesting. When you play one of those recordings back for your gaslighting narcissist, I can all but guarantee they will get extremely, extremely rageful and angry. Because the one thing they don't like is to be called out on their manipulative tricks. And when you have evidence, they'll turn around and gaslight you again. I told you you're a crazy person. You need to record everything. You know what? You make me sick. And you'll get that kind of really toxic, cruel pushback. At the core of it, and I think it's really important for all of you watching this, gaslighting is emotional abuse. Okay, let me say that again. Gaslighting is emotional abuse. The word abuse is a strong word, and it fits here. Because when you manipulate someone's reality, you are in essence stealing from them. You are in essence abusing and playing with their mind in a way that is nothing short of cruel. As far as I'm concerned, that qualifies as abuse. So when this is being done to you, take a really good look at it. And here's what's interesting. Gaslighting isn't just an individual phenomenon. I've observed something that I call gaslighting by tribe, something I've written about. What I mean by that is that other people in your family system might contribute. Like, that never happened in our family. Dad never said that. What are you saying? Come on, stop being so hard on Dad. It's a very triangulated dynamic. It's where one person is almost scapegoated in a family. Very, very common in narcissistic families. This can even happen in groups of friends. Like, oh, come on, he's not such a bad guy. You're saying, you feel as though, how is it? And then when it's a gaslighting by tribe, you start to feel like, I've got to be wrong because everyone else is saying the same thing. In the most tragic, toxic, and dangerous examples of gaslighting by tribe is when abuse is denied in a family system. That kind of denial can have devastating consequences for a person well into adulthood if that abuse took place in childhood. And finally, let's take it all the way up. Let's talk about societal gaslighting. When we're like, something doesn't quite feel right about what's going on in the world, and people say, no, everything's great, everything's normal, everything's fine in the world. And if you're on the wrong end of the stick on that one, and things don't feel like they're going right, and everyone's like, nah, everything's just fine, you do start feeling like you've walked into a party where everyone's been brainwashed. But in fact, the problem is most people feel like they're the ones who got it wrong, and everyone else has it right. There was once a famous test that was done by a psychologist called Solomon Asch. And in essence, in this research, they showed people 3 different line lengths. They were very different. One was taller and 2 more were shorter. And what they found was that even when clearly people chose the longest line, it was on a piece of paper, when they went into a group, there would be one other person in that group that was planted there by the researcher. And when that one other person picked a shorter line as the longest one, a significant number of other people in the group went along with that. They conformed to that. And while that's not classically a form of gaslighting, it really speaks to how much conformity plays a role in our lives and makes it hard sometimes to speak out. Societal gaslighting is so powerful because I believe it's the reason why narcissism seems to be growing exponentially in our society. No one seems to be able to stop it. If I had a dime for every person who said, nobody believes me, they don't believe this narcissism abuse thing is real, as though the only kind of abuse that counts is a black eye and not a bruised soul. And the number of people who said, yeah, all he does is yell at me. All he does is yell at you. And when people say, that's not abuse, or that doesn't seem that bad, or how bad can it be, or get over it, those are forms of gaslighting. The one thing none of us should ever let another person steal from us is our reality. Gaslighting is where that happens. Pay attention to it. It's the classical number 1 tool in a narcissist tool belt, and I don't want you to fall for it. So, narcissist warriors, get out there, pay attention to the gaslighting, and cut it off before it happens. Somebody gaslights with you, don't engage, and never doubt your own reality. First of all, let's talk about what it is. Projection is actually a concept that was introduced by Freud and his contemporaries. It's about this idea, and in simple layman's terms, it's a defense. It's what we call a defense. A defense is something that protects our ego. It sort of protects us from uncomfortable feelings. Things that churn up ancient, uncomfortable anxieties. And so things like projection protect us. Projection is what we call a primitive defense. It's really something that comes from early wounds, conflicts, and anxieties. And what it looks like is this. When a person is feeling something icky or forbidden inside of them, they project it onto someone else. So let's say someone is thinking, terrible, critical things about someone. They may say to you, hey, stop saying all those terrible, critical things. You'd be like, hello, what? I didn't do that. Even better is, let's say your partner accuses you of cheating. And not only have you not cheated, you couldn't even fathom it. And they say, hey, I noticed you had that business dinner, and they start making some really inappropriate accusations. You're like, huh? It's quite possible that they're projecting their own bad behavior, whether they're micro cheating or actually cheating or being inappropriate with someone, projecting that uncomfortable, unacceptable impulse behavior on you. Projection is one of those interesting psychological tells. When somebody accuses you or says things about you that really feel patently untrue or uncomfortable, instead of defending yourself, take a moment, think about it, and say, I know this is absolutely untrue about me, but it's interesting that that person is making that accusation. Projection is a tell because when somebody accuses you of something that's very untrue, odds are it's because they're experiencing it or they're doing it. So what projection is, in essence, it's basically like psychological vomit. It doesn't feel good. Like when you eat some bad fish and it needs to get out of you, you throw it up and then you feel better. Well, projection is like vomiting up psychological stuff. It feels really uncomfortable to have these forbidden thoughts or ideas in your head. So you throw them up on someone else and you accuse them and say things to them like, accuse them of what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling, and maybe even what they might be doing. It's very much what narcissists do. Narcissists have very, very uncomfortable inner worlds. And so as a result, they don't manage them well. When a healthy person feels something that kind of feels uncomfortable or unacceptable, they'll take a moment, they'll self-reflect on it, they'll recognize that it doesn't define them, they'll consider it, they'll weigh it in their mind, they'll ensure that they don't say something that hurts someone else, and then they'll move past it. For the narcissist, that kind of unacceptable impulse that's in them threatens their ego. And that's a very fragile space for them. So instead of managing it and self-regulating it, they pop it right back out on somebody else and whomever that convenient target is. That convenient target is someone who's usually someone they have projected on before, someone who's close, someone who's in an important relationship. So that can be a partner or a spouse, it can be an adult child or a child, it can be a parent, it can be a friend, it could be someone they work with, but someone who's close to them. Projection can be very confusing when you're first facing it because you'll hear these things and they're terrible accusations and they're untrue. But a lot of us, when we're faced with someone else's projection, we doubt ourselves. So when they feel deeply insecure, they start accusing us of having a bunch of insecurities. And if we're used to thinking being relatively confident, well put together people, will be like, okay. And then many of us who are mentally healthy are willing to see both sides of an equation. Our willingness to see their projected side of the equation can be a risky business because what's happening now is we're willing to take on their narcissistic projection and make it our own. Projection and narcissism go together like peas in a pod. It's just part of the picture. It's a classical part of a narcissistic clinical presentation. What that means for us is if we're in the presence of any significant or non-significant, frankly, narcissist in our lives, projection's part of the game. So when they're projecting their insecurity on us, their self-doubt on us, their anxieties on us, the key is that we don't make them our own. And in fact, that we recognize that their projections actually give us a lot of insight into them. What they're accusing us of is precisely what they're struggling with. So instead of being hurt and confused by those projections, try, if you can, to use them as a really important piece of data. And then you too can sort of be a narcissist whisperer, Jedi warrior, or just basically wizard. So thanks as always for listening. I hope this gives you some important insights into the narcissistic defense of projection. As always, click on that bell, get those notifications about our new content. Please subscribe to this channel to get all of the best content on narcissism and on narcissism and on narcissism and on narcissism and on narcissism.